Excellent. All right, looks like we're live. And my stream does not show it starting yet, but maybe soon. There it goes. Now I turn off my volume here, otherwise I get everything twice. Good. Okay. All right, well, here we are for our third and final chat with Mark Vellend. Hi, Mark. Welcome again. And I can, just a reminder, and we'll probably remind again when more people join, that it's a good idea to turn off your microphone when you're not speaking. And that way we keep feedback to a minimum. Let's see. So I have been trying to figure out what question we should kick off with, but I haven't got one yet. All right. So the last couple of times I've started with questions about like how the book got started or about the audience for the book. I guess, how about we start this one with a question about, like, do you feel, now that you've written this book, do you feel like you have, I don't want to say like gotten it out of your system, but do you feel like you've sort of covered what you wanted to say in terms of this theory? Do you feel like there's more you're going to want to say about it? I'll just leave it sort of open like that.
Yeah, well, I think it falls much more closely in line with you know, the first option, which is that I've, you know, that's what I wanted to say. You know, when I sort of just signed a contract to write a book, you know, I could have proposed something longer. I could have written something longer. So I didn't, it wasn't like I was constrained by space to say the things I wanted to say. And I think there'll be a period of a few years, I guess, where during which, depending on input you get from various people and reactions and my own reflections, maybe there'll be changes, more things to say, developments, and so on in the future. But in the short term, you know, there isn't. I don't have, you know, a drawer full of you know, additional things that I'm already planning to say. So our collective attention spans have shortened a bit over the years, and so people often, you know, are already thinking about the next thing, which is great. But yeah, personally, I think we'll let it gestate for a while and then see if anything else needs to be said in a few years.
Cool, great. And now I just want to open it up to anyone who wants to ask a question. I know you have questions you've been dying to ask, so go ahead.
Sorry, just trying to figure out my microphone there. So, hi Mark, this is Will, calling from Zurich. I had a question about how to integrate this perspective that you've proposed of how horizontal communities work, essentially, with ideas about vertical communities and the processes that shape them. So sometimes vertical interactions can look like horizontal interactions, like the case of apparent competition, but oftentimes those similarities dissolve pretty quickly when you start to understand the dynamics of those systems. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are about broadening this to include vertical interactions as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so I've had numerous discussions, either in person or on email and so on that particular topic. And so I think the best I can do is just sort of share different perspectives. And I don't yet myself have a strong opinion on the sort of correct answer to that question. So at one extreme, you know, I've had the opinion, you know, as recent, like even following the first of these online discussions we had, I was chatting with Patrick Thompson at the University of British Columbia. And so, you know, in that conversation, one perspective is that there's, you know, little difficulty in simply bringing into your definition of a community all the things that interact. And really the only alteration is that the nature of selection can change a bit in the sense that it's not so much that a herbivore has an advantage, a selective advantage over a plant. Well, now that I say that, maybe it does actually. So in some ways, you can just sort of weave these things in, and there's different forms of selection. Very, very frequently, it's density or frequency dependent when you have things interacting vertically. But that in and of itself is no great difficulty. Coming up with a currency to count things. Is it like the number of individuals? Is it their biomass? You have to make a decision there. But I guess my point is that at one end of the spectrum, your answer can simply be that there's no difficulty in weaving those things in. At the other end of the spectrum is the point of view, which is not necessarily in conflict with that, but that sure you can do that, but that doesn't, as a food web ecologist, that helps me not at all. I mean, I have this network of interactions, and I'm going to go the classic sort of food web approach, which itself actually, ignores some horizontal interactions pretty frequently, depending on how that analysis is done. And so from that point of view, just like stick with your horizontal communities and don't even attempt to come towards, something vertical. Somewhere in between, you can sort of still have a horizontal community. I mean, there's no hiding the fact that I'm a plant ecologist. And so, you can think of a herbivore as something that's sort of outside of your thing of focal interest. And of course, there's feedbacks between the two, but it doesn't prevent you from, considering the plant community as an entity, and it might interact with a community of herbivores. Very frequently you see plants and pollinators, these sort of interacting network type models. They're considered together, but they're also considered as two different things. And to me, it's not so much up to me to decide which of those perspectives is more or less valid or useful. That this is a great example of one in which the scientific community will decide where they see the utility in it. So I suppose, like, with that, I can toss the question back to you. Like, what's your answer to the question?
I think the way I saw it most easily integrating would be to think about some of these vertical interactions as just selection, and just a different form of selection and couching it within that. That sort of leads into another question, but I don't want to quite get there quite yet. So I guess I didn't see. I sort of saw more the perspective of integrating it, rather simply, like you were describing in the first scenario.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly glad to hear that. I mean, everybody wants their theory to apply as broadly as possible, but I'm also quite aware of the fact that you also don't want to, like, push it beyond its kind of reasonable domain of application either. So that's why I'm, at the moment, for the next little while, I'll let people like you and others decide whether or not it can integrate these things or not, and I'll accept the verdict of the jury.
Well, I think you kind of get at a point of sort of two different metrics for measuring your theory. There's like the ease of integrating these other things like vertical interactions, but then there's also sort of the utility of what you learn by integrating the vertical interactions, say, in with that theoretical framework. And so I think that is essentially like the two perspectives that you were talking about, are just people thinking about sort of measuring the impact of this perspective that you've laid out from two different perspectives.
Yeah, that's a good point. So certainly, I mean, pedagogically, I think it might be quite useful to think of vertical interactions as another form of selection, and whether or not researchers ultimately find that of any utility when they're going to go now study those interactions can be another question. So yeah, so maybe it isn't sort of there isn't one answer. It sort of depends on the context to what degree it's useful or not.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Great. All right. So any other questions? And don't forget, I might have muted you. If you're not talking, it's useful to be muted. So If you have trouble figuring out how to unmute, just send a little text in the chat menu window over on the side.
So hi, Mark. I'm Rafael. I'm a postdoc in North Dakota State University. I had a question. So I'm a behavioral ecologist. So I'm kind of really out of my depth reading this book. It's been really interesting. And I'm really interested in whether we can reframe ecology around individual variation, and should we? A lot of what's in your book seems to be really try to ignore individual variation to simplify larger processes of how community interacts and how you get specific community dynamics. And I'm wondering what's your take on that. There's been a surge of reintroducing individual variation within ecology in a couple years, and I'm wondering what's your take on this. And do we gain more power to explain community processes by doing so, or can we just stick with like treating individuals within a species as sufficiently similar that when you compare to the next species?
Yeah, that's a good question. So thanks. It's nice to meet you, and I'm glad to know that you've decided to read the book despite the fact that it's maybe a little far afield. So the perspective that individual variation, or often the same principle is discussed as intraspecific variation. I mean, I myself have contributed to papers and perspectives that promote the idea that that's a really important consideration. And as with almost anything in ecology, it's going to be its utility is going to depend on the context you're in. So, as a scientist, we always have to make some simplifying assumptions. There's no such thing as a model or a conceptual framework in which we don't make some effort to simplify things, ignore some sources of variation. So if you're going to talk about, what explains the latitudinal gradient of bird diversity in North America, I doubt highly that you're going to have in your conceptual framework some consideration of the phenotype and behavior of every single bird in the whole continent. If you are studying, a few strongly interacting species in a lake, in a single lake where you can, follow the dynamics pretty carefully, then it could well be that ignoring some of that intraspecific individual level variation will lead you astray. And again, it depends on what you're trying to predict. If you're trying to predict the periodicity of a predator-prey cycle, then you might be off if you don't consider sort of rapid evolution. I'm thinking of these old microcosm papers, but considering that intraspecific variation doesn't actually change the prediction that there will be some sort of predator-prey cycle. So again, it depends on the precision of the kinds of predictions you're after, what you're trying to predict, the scale, and so on. And so reframing all of ecology or all of community ecology through the individual seems, well, to sort of push it into everything doesn't necessarily seem fruitful. So that's sort of one answer. And one other little thing to add is that so if you take my definition of fitness and selection and so on, it's about the average. It's about average fitness differences across individuals within different species. So individuals are actually in that definition, and the reason that's important is that I wanted to be clear that we're not talking about group selection. So it's not selection for the species, the same way that within a population, it's the individual fitness that matters, but it's actually the average fitness of all the individuals of a certain genotype or with certain alleles that determine the evolutionary trajectory. But it's not group selection at the level of genotype. And so it allows for that. And if you were to build a model, using this framework, you could very easily incorporate it. It could be an individual-based model with no sort of technical, there's no technical barrier to doing that. If you have lots and lots of species, you're maybe unlikely to proceed that way. But yeah, I guess my point is that the conceptual framework certainly doesn't exclude that as something you could add, and there's some contexts in which you would want to do it, and others in which it seems less likely to be the thing you want to do.
Thank you.
And of course, anybody else who has comments on answers or anything to add is welcome to jump in. This doesn't need to be perfectly linear or perfectly back and forth.
Any new questions?
I can ask another if you don't mind. So early on in the book, you talked about the differences between sort of high and low level processes and the value of organizing our thinking about biology under these sort of higher order umbrellas. And I'm curious, to me, it struck me a lot like the change from biology and zoology departments to ecology, evolution, cell biology departments. Would you, based on this sort of view of biology and the value of grouping together these things under higher order processes, advocate a change in, say, university structure to reflect sort of like a selection department that would have evolutionary biologists and immunologists, for example? Do you see any utility in that, or is that just taking the concept way too far?
Oh yeah. I think I'm gonna have to go with taking it too far. So
I kind of thought the same, but I was just curious.
I mean, we have this ongoing challenge in not just science, but in research. Let's say in higher education, about how to break ourselves into groups of some sort, and so. Just as sort of an anecdote, when I was at the University of British Columbia, it was quite interesting because they still have botany and zoology departments there, and yet most of the colleague-to-colleague interactions occur across those departmental lines within, let's say, ecology and evolution. And then they built something called the Biodiversity Research Center, which put together, roughly speaking, that the set of people that were interacting the most within ecology and evolution. And as you said, like many universities have gone to that structure, but of course there's still quite a, there's still stronger links among the plant ecology and evolution people, let's say, than there are among the like limnologists, let's say. So we identify ourselves in many different ways, and I doubt that we'd want to go all the way to the Department of Selection. I don't think anybody would want to be in the Department of Drift, for example. But on the other hand, I do think there's really some interesting opportunities for thinking about this conceptual framework. And when I say this conceptual framework, I don't mean like mine applied to other things, because really what I've done is taken an existing conceptual framework, put it into community ecology. It's already been put into social sciences. I mentioned in one of our previous chats a book by a guy named Alex Masudi, who Chicago University Press 5, 6, 7 years ago, I can't remember. He basically did a very similar thing, taking like Darwinian thinking and applying it to the social sciences. It's already obviously, the dominant paradigm within evolutionary biology. But any situation in which you have variants that arise somehow, a variant could be a species, an allele, a business practice, a language, anything, some capacity for them to move around in space, be selected amongst, some work better than others, some have greater success than others, and for some stochastic change. All of that fits into this same scenario. And I'm always thinking ahead, and I'm thinking of like sabbatical 2022 or something. Maybe there's like a whole like broader synthesis to be done there, or maybe there isn't. Maybe there isn't much more to do than recognizing that they've all adopted this framework in that. So Graham Bell has a book that's just called Selection. And in that book, he refers to that sort of framework as the second science. The first science being, physics and chemistry, where everything reduces to these physical laws. And in the second science, you cannot reduce, the evolution via natural selection to purely physical laws. It just doesn't work. And so there's this second science that, maybe we could have two faculties. There's the first science and the second science, although, yeah, I don't know, that seems to give priority to the first one, but you get my point. There's a certain set of sciences that are, or not even topics that are united by that particular framework.
Thanks for entertaining what is admittedly a bit of a bizarre question.
It's a fun question.
I'm going to build off of that a little bit with one of the questions on the sheet that we haven't gotten to explicitly, I don't think. So the question that somebody asks reads, given that selection seems to be such a broad, high-level process incorporating many more lower-level processes compared to the other three, how do we use the concept constructively going forward? And it continues, how much have we learned if we can show simply that community assembly is based mostly on selection? And I'll just add, so I didn't write that question, but I'll just add on to the end of it. Do you think that there's room for, I don't say room, do you think there's a need to more research on understanding low-lying processes of the other three high-level processes that have not received as much attention?
Okay, let's start in parts there. So let's.
Sorry, too many at the same time.
Yeah. So sometimes the add-on.
So the first part was.
Yeah, no, I got it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I think one key thing to remember in considering that type of question is that there are different forms of selection. So selection is a category, and so to simply come to the conclusion that we can explain most of community dynamics based on selection, that is not a very profound or particularly useful statement. But it's those forms of selection that in fact represent like really distinct ideas that people have about how communities work. So if priority effects dominate, then in the terminology of this framework, that's sort of a positive frequency dependence of some sort, where you get multiple stable states. And if it's negative frequency dependent, it's very different. And if you have the sort of constant selection leading to monodominance, again, that's very different. And so distinguishing, for example, between those three forms of selection is of massive importance in trying to understand how your community functions and to predict what might happen in that community. So, and to me, there's huge utility in doing that, because it really helps, I think, different researchers recognize when they're talking about the same high-level thing or a different high-level thing. So whether or not your negative frequency dependence, if that's what you have, is underlain by a herbivore choosing to eat whatever's most abundant, or whether it's intraspecific competition for resources, that's really interesting. But to predict coexistence, what you really want to know is whether or not that higher level phenomenon is happening. So that I think is the short, or maybe not that short, answer to the first part. That understanding the forms of selection and then how they interact with those other things really is a pretty important first step. And so maybe now you can repeat the second half.
Yeah, so I guess my understanding of this question was more that, hey, if everybody's basically been looking at low-level selection processes, and then we have this framework and we decide, oh yeah, selection is super important, like, didn't we kind of already know that? But I guess, let's see, so what was the other part of this question? So that was the second part of the question. And then like my bit of that isn't part of that question, but I think ties in, is has to do with, like, in reading the book, right, the selection chapters, both the theory and the empirical evidence, were very thorough, and that's because there's been a lot of work done in empirical low-lying selection processes and how that, and you did a nice job relating this to higher level way of thinking about them. But for me personally, I felt a little bit disappointed by some of the discussion of some of the other processes, and I think part of that is because they haven't received as much attention, and certainly not for as long a period of time. So my question is, like, is there more that is needed in those areas, or is it really just that they're simpler processes and they don't have as many low-level processes going on?
Yeah, so I guess that's that's an interesting question, the way you've posed it. And I guess I wonder, are the selection chapters more thorough, or are they just longer because there's more of an empirical and theoretical basis to write about? In fact, they might be less thorough because there's so much more to cover. You know, so if one topic is 90% of the literature, and you know that chapter is 40% of that section, then maybe they're actually less, well, not less thorough in the sense that they cover less of the conceptually distinct things, but that they cover less of the a proportionally smaller part of the literature. So I guess that's sort of a response to the question about whether or not they're, you know, more or less thorough. Now, on the other processes, is there more to do? You know, so one thing you said was, are they simpler? So there's a, in some senses they're simpler. You know, so let's just take like dispersal and drift, for example. And in other senses, especially when it comes to dispersal, they're more complicated because you know, dispersal, if it varies among species, becomes an underlying part of selection, which is something mentioned in the book, and then it becomes actually more challenging to study as an empirical ecologist. So a lot of the sort of meta-community studies on dispersal involve microcosms of some sort, and then when they involve field data, it's really just sort of taking data where we have multiple plots and trying to make sense of something about spatial proximity. That the link to dispersal is pretty extremely indirect, let's say. So to really study, you know, like I've got a landscape here where there's patches of forest and agricultural landscape, to really understand how ongoing dispersal of plants or animals or whatever among them influences their dynamics is a huge empirical challenge. And so I guess I'd say, yeah, there is maybe a lot more to do on some of those topics, and certainly for drift. I mean, for some people, they don't feel compelled to study that, given that, you know, that perhaps it's just not of massive importance. But on the other hand, you know, maybe we actually need some studies where people specifically try to manipulate only community size. This is mentioned in the last chapter as well, somehow holding other things constant. So I know, I mean, one of Jonathan's other postdocs, Ben Gilbert, did some experiments like that we haven't quite seen published yet, but I sent him an email once a year asking him when they're coming out, because we just don't have that many studies like that. So I mean, that's one that sort of relates to Will's earlier question. Maybe in 10 years we'll be in a much better position to actually fill out those chapters. I suspect maybe on the selection side they'd look quite similar, but maybe the other chapters are the ones that are going to look quite different in 10 years. In a totally hypothetical sense, not that someone's actually going to write them, but if somebody did.
Just to riff on one of the ideas that you brought up, you mentioned this issue about dispersal sort of becoming selection, and we see that same sort of thing happening in population genetics with spatial selection, where some sort of dispersal ability that a trait can kind of evolve across an invasion front of a population that's moving through space. And it's because that some genotypes are better able to disperse that you get out at this leading edge of the invasion front a different trait composition than you see, back in the sort of the source population or further back in other waves that came earlier.
Yeah, that's right. So that, I mean, well, yeah, once again, the analogies sort of help us out, because in many population genetic models, you just have a parameter m, which is gene flow. This is how much things move around. But of course, that, as you say, is an evolvable trait. So that parameter can evolve, as can, of course, the selection coefficient. So I mean, that's, if you have two species interacting, then the degree of selection among them itself will evolve as well. So that's yeah, the analogy holds, quite strongly at the two levels.
Sorry, just to continue the analogy with population genetics, it looks like we're on a similar case where selection and speciation, selection and mutation are two processes that are the bulk of what's happening to explain population genetics. So it's fine if drift and gene flow have different properties and don't necessarily give as much attention. I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, sure, some of those processes can be very hard to study, but I think also it's fine to, when you look at evolutionary biology, a lot of it is devoted to how selection acts. And it's not ignoring the other processes, it's just saying that most traits are the results of evolution, and if you want to understand how they're interacting with fitness, well, you have to look at the part that's heritable and that's responding to selection. So I don't think that's necessarily a not giving enough attention to the other processes. It's just that we have one or two major processes that are high level, but still major compared to the other two major processes. I don't know what would be your take on that? And
yeah, I mean, so I agree with you, and I mean the thought that it prompts is that, one could argue that in community ecology, drift for a long time, and maybe even still to some degree, is simply ignored. Like, let's just pretend it doesn't exist, basically. And there the analogy becomes quite interesting, because for forever, there's been a debate in population genetics about whether or not drift really plays an important role. And most people, I think, would agree that, selection is the key to understanding most of the interesting types of evolutionary patterns we see. But you won't find any evolutionary biologist that says that we can simply, therefore, like, not have a chapter in it on our population genetics book, right? Like you need to understand it in certain scenarios, and scenarios that are not so rare as to be something you can ignore, like from the outset of a given study. You have to at least think about whether or not it might be important. And I guess that's the sort of perspective I would offer in community ecology. It's maybe not the first place to look. If you're walking into a community trying to sort out what's going on, that's maybe not the first thing you try to sort out. But if you simply always assume that that's not going to be a major player, then sometimes you're gonna make a mistake often enough that you want it in your toolbox as one of the potential processes. But as you say, does it deserve, as many journal pages as do studies of selection? Almost certainly not, because it's important. It's going to be less often important in natural systems. One would predict anyway. We have yet to hear from Shan.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm Sean.
Sean, excuse me.
At University of Minnesota. Yeah, I've just mostly been happy so far to be a fly on the wall.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, our group did have our group spent a lot of time, I think, like a lot of people, trying to scope out where does the framework that you outline meet its limits in understanding how horizontal communities work. I think one thing that I was curious about is kind of how the role of fuzziness in what we consider a species, not intraspecific variation per se, because I accept a lot of what you say about things like about what you were saying to Raphael earlier, but I think one in particular I was kind of stimulated by one paper that I read that I really enjoyed, that found that in a community of eucalyptus, that the likelihood of co-occurrence between species was decreased by the potential for hybridization. So you have these kind of microevolutionary phenomena that then affect how the community is structured because of the ways that gene flow works. And I don't really know that I have a specific question for you about this, but I guess that is that something that can be incorporated into the framework that you outlined, or is that something that is just adding another layer of complexity that would need that requires more kind of theoretical work to assimilate?
Yeah, so that topic came up in the first of these online discussions, and if that was you that suggested that paper in the online questions,
yeah,
then yeah, well, I thank you for that, because that is a really cool paper. I hadn't seen it before, and I scratched my head a little bit about it, and then in the end, my sort of take on it was that it is another low-level process that I'd never thought of, and I'd imagine, well, maybe many people hadn't either, by which the fitness of a tree is negatively impacted by the proximity of individuals of particular other species. And so in this case, the fact that they make inviable hybrid offspring reduces the fitness of that tree when it's in proximity to these other trees with which it has that interaction. But whether or not that were the mechanism, or proximity to that species were reduced fitness because their nutrient niches overlap too much, once you're at these sort of high level processes, again, it doesn't really matter. Why exactly that individual's fitness is reduced when too many of these other types of individuals are around. So it's sort of an example of a low level process that is potentially important in some systems, novel in the sense that I doubt many people had really thought about that before, but in the end it can actually be fit in, as far as I can tell, pretty cleanly. Like it doesn't push us outside the limits of this particular framework.
All right. So this may not end up changing your evaluation, and probably won't. But I think the mechanism that they found in that paper wasn't actually that it created a negative impact on the fitness because the hybrid offspring had lower fitness. What was actually happening was that gene flow from if one eucalyptus species was to kind of invade, was to enter an area dominated by a eucalyptus species with which it could hybridize, it wouldn't be that the hybrid offspring have lower fitness, but that eventually through process of back crossing, it would eventually become much more like one species or the other, and so I don't know that. So in this case, it's not so much that it's an effect on the fitness that can be that you measure in terms of like the reproductive output or something like that, or in terms of demographic rates, but that it's just becoming that those offspring become progressively more like one species or like the other species.
Okay, so I mean, admittedly, I just read the abstract and skimmed very quickly, but I could have sworn there was an analysis of like co-occurrence, like particular pairs of species were less likely to co-occur together than at random, and that was the underlying mechanism. Yeah, but if that's the case, then there must be some. So these hybrids that pop up, do they classify them as one species or the other? Do they begin there, or
I think
maybe.
So the only reason that the only purpose for which they classified hybrids in this paper was to determine whether two species could hybridize. So they did that using morphological evidence and using genetic evidence as well. But then so they didn't. I don't think they went through and tried to classify. Well, they determined which two species were the parents, but like what species those were for the purpose of the co-occurrence analysis, it didn't really matter.
But to talk about co-occurrence, we probably shouldn't go into too much depth on a paper that neither of us wrote, but for the purpose of an analysis of co-occurrence, when you find a tree in the field, you have to call it either this one or that one or neither.
Right. Most of the trees were not hybrids. Like were not identified, and they may have had some distant past integration event, but they were not like clearly identifiable as being hybrids. Most of the trees seem to be, very morphologically similar to one of the to one particular species.
Yeah. All right. I think I'll just have to leave it as like that. Okay. I'll read that. I'll have to read it in more detail before I can say anything halfway intelligent beyond what I've already said. But I do thank you for that reading suggestion.
It seems, just to build on that before we put the point away, that it seems like there's a lot of the same problems that they run into in microbial ecology, and that if you wanted to apply this framework to microbial ecology, the difficulty of defining what a species is becomes really challenging, and that where you have this more continuous concept of what a species is might pose some challenges for thinking about many of our ways of understanding how communities work.
Absolutely. I mean, so microbial ecologists have developed these sort of techniques where they, sequence at least stretches of DNA from basically any microbe that they find in their sample, and then they do classify them essentially into these sort of operational taxonomic units of some sort. Whether or not the meaningfulness of those categories is certainly open for debate, but microbial ecologists are actually one group of people that seems to have actually found the framework useful that I hadn't anticipated in advance, and part of it is actually because of the difficulty, I think, of studying the low-level processes. You can sort of study patterns and try to figure out what high-level processes best explain some of those patterns, and it's actually more difficult to study the low-level processes. Whereas if you have a couple of zooplankton in a container, it's actually the low-level thing that you notice first. You see them eating, and that's sort of the thing that you study. But yeah, microbes, and certainly with horizontal gene transfer. I mean, how to define a species is difficult to begin with. But then the fact that they're just sort of swapping genome, or not whole genomes, but swapping genes with each other, way more frequently than people realized in the past. Causes headaches for people. That's for sure. I mean, it's a challenge, I suppose, not just for my framework, but for any sort of community level study, because you have all these things growing together, and at opposite ends of the spectrum, there's microbes in there that probably never exchange genes. They do totally different things. Nobody would argue that they're different evolutionary units, and where to put the divisions in between is pretty tough. But it's also probably not advisable to just think of it as all one big schmear. That's probably not going to get you forward either. But that strikes me as a challenge that faces community ecology in general, rather than this particular manifestation of it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
So since we've gotten into the empirical side of things, I have a question that actually follows up from the chat we had last week. And the main question is, if we're trying to, say, figure out parameters in the model based on your framework, and we've identified our horizontal community, we need to sample from it to get data that we can use. How much is enough? And I know the obvious answer is it depends on the question you're asking. But last week you mentioned, for example, if you're sampling plants versus sampling insects, right? You have for plants, you might put down a quadrat and identify all of the plants in your quadrat and say, okay, I know what my horizontal community is for this delineated area. But then if you're studying insects, you might put out a trap and you'll get some sampling of insects, and then that's some sampling of the horizontal community, but that's not a community in of itself. I've done both, and I actually see both of them as sampling, and neither one is actually collecting everything. But then I go and treat those as communities for the sake of understanding what's going on. Can you say something about how much, assuming that we're going to be pretty bad about getting 100% of any horizontal community in doing data collection, what should we be aiming for? What's a reasonable amount of coverage over a horizontal community, however defined, to be able to actually do a good job at under your theory? Go.
Yeah, I'm unlikely to say anything here that's going to be incredibly useful, I think. So, I mean, it sounds like a cop-out to say that it depends, although that's also, you know, an element of reality. It really does depend on what particular question you're trying to answer. And to some degree, this relates to the earlier issue of sort of vertical versus horizontal communities. And there's always been an interesting relationship between empirical and theoretical studies, in the sense that we need our definitions, well, we want our theoretical definitions of entities like communities to be clean, theoretically clean, all primary producers, but of course, when I, go out and sample my plant community, there's algae, in there, like even on the soil, on the surface, probably doing something that I'm definitely not incorporating. There are a decent number of studies where you get all bryophytes, trees, like all higher plants, or whatever you want to call them. And then, of course, on the empirical side, you want definitions that, in fact, are operational. And so, at one extreme, we can simply define a community as whatever somebody studies. And that is not perfectly satisfactory, because it's just licensed to do whatever you want. But on the other hand, you don't want a definition, the community sensu lato, which is everything, and if you don't study that, you're not studying communities. And finding a sort of happy medium between the two is, I suppose, part of the art of science, really. And so, as all of my own sort of empirical studies that I've been a data collector for have been on plants, and sometimes it's all the plants. Mosses up through anything, and then sometimes it's only herbaceous understory plants, and we often have a reason for wanting to study that particular groups. Very often in the literature, it's just like the woody plants, because those are the dominants in the ecosystem. And personally, I find that I'm satisfied, if you will, that that we're talking about a set of things that have a non-arbitrary sort of bound around the definition. And then, this even relates to the microbial question, in that some of those microbes can be doing like wildly different functional things. You know, some of them are like absorbing other ones. Some of them are metabolizing, you know, like sulfur compounds. I mean, they're all over the place, and it really becomes sort of operational. It's like whatever's in this gram of soil, if you will. And just to repeat what I said earlier, I don't anticipate by the end of this answer that you're going to be satisfied, or that I'll have provided new and deep insights. But just that in each case, you know, we want to define our community in a way that doesn't just sort of like any set of anything just counts. You know, some reasonable definition, and yet not being too rigid about it. You know, absolutely must include everything that might fall into this historical component. You know, and if somebody wants to study the lynx and the hare in a predator-prey cycle, you know, the people who do that often then learn, oh, we have to pay some attention to the owls and what the hares are eating and so on. But it's entirely justifiable to have that lynx and hare as your core thing, and just drawing what you need to understand that without having every other small mammal and every other predator. So yeah, there's a very artistic element to doing ecology, and I think you may have identified one of those areas. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that?
I was just going to say that I think we in general have a really poor understanding about how modular communities are, right? Like if communities are very modular, we can take this simplifying approach very easily, and it works. We would expect it to scale really nicely. But if they don't work in a modular way, you know, understanding the interactions between rock and scissors and paper and scissors and, you know, whatever the other one is, doesn't tell you what's going to happen in a game of rock, paper, scissors. So things like intransience and all sorts of other ways that the communities can be non-modular can really, you know, throw a wrench in the works. And I don't know that we have enough studies that sort of encompass the scales of organisms and of space and of time in order to be able to really say whether we think, you know, these ecological systems we study are modular enough to get away with this sort of simplification. Yeah,
I mean, if we can't get away with modularizing them to some degree, then we're in trouble, I think, because I mean, so Bob Holt has, you know, pushed the idea of understanding whole systems by trying to understand, you know, the modular bits of it. So, you know, a predator-prey interaction, a predator with two prey, two competitors, and so on. And I think there's definitely some validity to the argument that if you don't understand at least how those two things or three things might interact in isolation, then you're going to have a hell of a difficulty understanding how, you know, that system will function when everything is all sort of connected at once. Then, of course, there are these approaches, these sort of network approaches, but often, you know, often they're not even addressing the same exact questions. Do you know what I mean? Like the idea is what determines, you know, the sort of connectedness or stability, which isn't even the same question that somebody's studying when they study a predator-prey cycle. And so to say, you know, you'll often hear people push a certain approach as superior because it incorporates these things that the other doesn't incorporate, and rarely are they actually attempting to address the same actual question. And so whenever somebody tells me they're using the best approach, I almost always enter the devil's advocate role of saying no and then figuring out why, because it's rarely the case that one particular approach to doing ecology is objectively superior. Again, it doesn't mean that we can just and should and can do anything at all and it's fine. You know, all approaches are equally valid to a particular question. But if there were particular approaches that were objectively superior at doing community ecology, we may have converged on them by now. So I doubt that that's actually the case.
So I know some of the people that are in this conversation may not have gotten to the end of the book, but towards the end, you do kind of take a look at this alternative way of viewing community ecology at a systems level, as opposed to worrying about the modularity, just stepping back and abstracting to whole systems with macroecology. I was curious if you could. You gave a short section on it, but I was curious if you could kind of expand on what you think the potential is for integrating your views with macroecology, or if that's even like just a non-starter because of the sort of finer grain versus macro scale dichotomy in the way that these disciplines or these approaches are framed.
Yeah, so macroecology is itself a pretty heterogeneous entity. So really, I mean, someone can correct me if they have a different take on things, but it's the large spatial scale of things that defines macroecology, not any particular conceptual framework to tackling questions at that scale. And so there are some studies that fall under the umbrella of macroecology, trying to explain why different continents have different numbers of species, trying to explain latitudinal diversity gradients and so on, that I see no trouble. I see no trouble with cohesion with my own perspective. I mean, you can absolutely think about those questions in terms of the same four high-level processes. So the particular sort of theory in macroecology that sort of confounded me in the sense that I just couldn't see how things connected was this particular, maxent theory that John Hart and colleagues have put forward. And it took me a while just to actually figure out what they were doing. I mean, they're doing something quite different than what we traditionally do, which is obviously one of the points that they sell as, why it's an important thing to do. And I just, without going into the details, I just had trouble seeing how things were gonna be put together there. But that's not exact. That is really one particular approach to macroecology. That it's definitely not even. It's not a dominant approach. It's not. It is one particular way in which macroecology is done, which I have difficulty relating to my own theory, but that doesn't generalize to the whole field of macroecology. So, but Brian McGill is writing a book called, I think he's just going to call it Large Scale Ecology. It's basically going to be macroecology, and I hope that there's something in there maybe that tries to put these things together. I definitely look forward to reading that one day.
Is that a monograph he's working on, or textbook, or what?
I don't know exactly the nature of it. So when I asked him to read my book and give me comments, what I offered in return was to read his, and I haven't seen any of it yet. So I think it might be some ways off, but and maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. Maybe it's a secret. Well, I hope not. I doubt it. Well, just the fact that he's working on it, but when we can expect it and exactly the nature of it is obviously a question for him and not for me, but it's definitely one that I look forward to.
So sorry for not being more clear about my question, but I was thinking more along the lines of Maxent and how to reconcile it with that. So
yeah, I have no idea. That's my answer.
Yeah, I think it's just two different ways of looking at problems, and I've heard physicists, including John himself, describe ecology as difficult because it's this idea of like an intermediate numbers problem. With small numbers, like orbiting planets, you can kind of keep track of each thing that's moving in the system and understand it very well. But once you get to the point of particles in air in the room, it's so much better just to take their average kinetic energy and call that temperature and study the system that way, as sort of this aggregate statistical mechanical process. And it's not clear that ecology, to me at least, it's not clear that ecology falls cleanly in one of those camps, and that maybe the best way forward is doing sort of a combination of both investigations. And I don't know what the opportunities are though for synthesis between them. Hopefully something, but I don't really see a clear path. Yeah, well, right. Maybe somebody one day will discover the clear path. They'll find the science of intermediate numbers problems, but it's not going to be me probably, and maybe it'll be you, and maybe it'll be a ways off in the future. But
or at one point we'll be able to study everything at the same time. in very controlled situations.
Everything at the same time. I think that's impossible.
No, I know. But it seems like it's what would be necessary to answer some of the bigger questions. Sometimes it feels like when you're trying to get into those nested levels, where you have individuals within population, within species, and all those stuff interact with each other. It feels like sometimes that's what's required, and I think ecology is at its best when you have like 2 or 3 species that you know very well, a system that's very well defined, and you can poke at this system in a very controlled way, and then you can really dig at some of the mechanism. When we start to zoom out, like we're going to strip a lot of the local or intermediate scale processes, and we're making a kind of leap of faith that, well, at the scale that we're studying, they just don't matter enough. I think it's a good assumption, but I'm just wondering, like, how many times are we going to be proven wrong if we're making this kind of assumption?
Yeah, I mean, well, as with many other questions, there's multiple elements in there, and the one that spurned a thought and then had me listening less to the rest, because I was thinking about that part of it, was when you talked about progress made when you have a few species that interact strongly. And there's definitely a really important and successful tradition in doing that. And I think the fear is that there's just enough systems that simply don't fit that criteria. So if you go to a tropical rainforest, there are not 2 or 3 things or 4 things interacting strongly that drive the whole system, as far as I know and as far as I can tell. And a lot of the situations in which you do have that are like lakes, for example, where people often have, there's like one thing that fills a certain role, or maybe 2. Whereas even in like a prairie plant community, there's species that are more abundant than one another. But it's pretty rare that there's like a few that just sort of determine everything. And so I'm not sure, I don't know if you meant to say it this way, but I'm not sure that that's like ecology working at its best. That's a system to which our approaches are very well suited, but you do have to wonder how broadly applicable the insights are from studying systems of that nature.
Well, what I mean is that's where we get the most depth in terms of understanding how the system works, because we can poke at the system in very different ways, and it's simple enough that it's still tractable.
Yeah,
What I mean. And as soon as we start, as you say, like as soon as we start including multiple species that each have like 2 or 3 roles, yeah, that becomes much harder to track. And it feels like for this type of ecology of like really understanding the system in depth, like we get discouraged to get at to harder systems in a way, and then we only focus on those very iconic, easily manipulable habitats or species. Evolutionary biology has the same problems, like, well, we're just going to do it with sticklebacks. Yep. And then like we ignore like all the harder species, and I think it's a challenge that's larger than just ecology. It's just like the nature of biodiversity, that there's a lot of species that are not abundant, and we don't even know their natural history well enough to even start to think about their larger ecological roles.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, this question of how representative the things we study are of all the things we don't study is it pervades biology well beyond ecology. I totally agree.
Okay, and we are past the hour, so I am going to say that we stop. Thank you, Mark Vellend, again for coming and answering questions, and thank you all for coming and asking questions. It's been a lot of fun.
And thank you, Margaret, for organizing all of this and facilitating.
Oh, you're welcome.
This has been great.
It was a great experience.
Yeah, thanks to all of you. I love getting questions, and I love chatting about it. Don't be shy to send me an email if you have more thoughts or questions. And yeah, thanks to Margaret for coordinating all this stuff. I'm a social media dinosaur, so one of the reasons I always have a smile on my face is it's just, I don't know, just the fact that it's happening is in and of itself kind of amusing. But it's been great.
All right. Well, thanks, guys.
Goodbye.
Right.
Take care.
Right.
Bye.
Right.
See you.